Hi guys, welcome to another video in the Z170 Pro Gaming Asus motherboard update series. This one is about installing an NVMe M.2 solid state drive. I'm going to give you the condensed version, and if you feel like it, you can keep watching and I'll give you a blow-by-blow account of the process that I actually went through. Now here's the condensed version, but a disclaimer. This is a guide to installing an NVMe as a second solid state drive. So we're still booting up into Windows off a regular SATA solid state drive. Okay, and I think doing it this way is easier rather than starting from scratch and trying to make the M2 a boot drive from scratch. Okay, so this is the condensed version. Number one, do a BIOS update on the motherboard. The latest version is actually from 2018, but you download it from the Asus website. There's a video on this channel and videos on other channels. To avoid confusion, disconnect any secondary hard drives you might have installed. Just keep your regular SATA boot drive installed. Just unplug the others, very easy. 2, go into Windows and go into an internet browser, go to the Asus website where you get the BIOS update and click on the drivers tab and get the SATA driver update. Install that driver. If you happen to reinstall Windows at some point, I think you may need to install it again, but I don't know. I would install it again just in case. If you happen to get a black screen at any point during this, use a VGA cable monitor, and that should get you back to a normal screen. 3, install the M2 drive physically. Obviously shut down the computer first, power it all off, but install the drive physically. You will need a small screw to hold it down, and it's a M3 socket, so it's this single notch, if I understand correctly, NVMe drive. Now I installed a modern card, actually PCIe Gen 4 2TB NVMe. Socket 3 fitted perfectly. It'll be running at PCIe 3 speeds, of course. Go into Windows, so boot up the computer, go into Windows, go into Disk Management. To go into Disk Management, you type in Disk Management in the search bar next to the Microsoft Windows button at the bottom left of your screen. It might come up under the title Create and Format Hard Disk Partition. It's the same program. Open that up. From one of the menus up the top, you can drop it down and hit rescan. Try that if your drive doesn't show, but it should show up at this point. It won't be showing up in my PC yet. Okay. In the same program, the drives will show up sort of in the bottom half of the screen in this program. Your boot drive will probably be called drive 0, and the new drive will probably be called drive 1, and it should show the sizes. Right click the new drive and select New Simple Volume. Go through that process. Just make the volume as the max volume of the drive. That'll be the default setting. You can put a label on there. You could call it, Kingston SSD or whatever you want. You can assign a drive letter. It's pretty simple. Takes about a minute. 7, the drive should show up in my PC at this point. Now, I did not actually have to change anything in the BIOS. I did not have to swap SATA ports. It is said that the SATA 1 port, if I understood what I read correctly, would be disabled once you're running an NVMe card in the M2 slot. that didn't happen with me. If it happens with you, you may have to swap your boot drive to a different SATA port. Very easy to do. And you may have to go into the BIOS to tell it to boot off that. I wasn't running a video card during this. I took the video card out. And it may be because the video card is a PCIe card and it's using some of the lanes. It may be at that point you need to do the SATA swap if you put a video card in there. So just be aware, if you can't boot up off your SATA drive, it's because the port was disabled. Now, that's the short version, which wasn't that short, but anyway. Now I'm going to give you an account of what I actually went through in order to create this summary. And what I went through involved experimentation, failure, and more failure, and eventually success. So it's the same story with a bunch of extra steps put in. I'm including it in this video because it might be useful if you have to troubleshoot like I did. Okay, so this is now the start of the long version. Disclaimer, I'm running Windows 10 Pro, but it's a slightly glitchy installation because it's been on the PC for several years. As I said, I removed a GTX 970 video card and just ran the monitor off the onboard graphics. And as I said, I disconnected a secondary SATA drive, which had nothing to do with this, and just booted off of the boot drive. The M.2 drive I used and installed was a Kingston KC3000 PCIe 4.0 purchased in December 2024. Okay. Now we go through the steps. Well, this was done after updating the BIOS to the latest version, which is from 2018. I did not reinstall Windows first. Remove the graphics card, as I said, and the boot drive was on SATA 1. I physically installed the drive, the single notch SSD, 2280 in size, and I screwed it down. I booted into Windows just fine off the original SATA drive, but the new M.2 drive did not show in my PC. I restarted and went into the BIOS. The M.2 drive did not show in the boot priority list or anywhere else in the BIOS. Only the SATA drive and the optical drive, which is also SATA, showed. I set it to manual. Then I set M.2 and SATA Express mode configuration to M.2. Hit exit. So the only change I made was setting the M.2-SATA onboard detect mode to auto, and then there's a little subsection of that which is called M.2 and SATA Express mode configuration, which I set to M.2. Self-saved, I've exited the BIOS, the PC is rebooted, but it only went to BIOS, not to Windows. So I go into the BIOS, no drives are showing in boot priority. When I click switch all, I could not find any bootable devices. I surmised that the SATA port controlling the Windows SSD was disabled. So I hit exit, the computer just went to a black screen. After a minute, I just turned off the computer at the power supply. I plugged the boot drive into a different SATA port. It was like 3 or 4 or something like that. I turned on the computer and it booted to Windows. However, the M.2 drive did not show up in my PC. Now at this point, I didn't know about disk management, so I wasn't looking in there, okay, just for disclosure. So I restarted and I went into the BIOS again. Only the Windows SATA drive was showing in the boot priority list and not the M.2. The SATA hot plugs in PCIe storage configuration were showing us disabled. I don't know if that's significant or not. In the boot page, only the old SATA drive showed in boot option 1. Something showed as disabled, presumably the optical drive. I exited the BIOS without making changes. So at this point, the situation is kind of weird. It seems like somehow we installed the drive and it disabled SATA 1, which was semi-expected. But then when we got the boot drive going again on a different SATA port, we go into Windows, we still can't see the M2 drive. We go into the BIOS and we still can't see the M2 drive there either. I went into Windows next and I downloaded the SATA driver from the Asus website on the adjacent tab to the BIOS drivers. The file downloaded completely. The next bit's very weird. I clicked on the downloaded file arrow at the top right of the Google Chrome window. The file name showed up for a second. I did not click on it or ask it to run in any way. Then my screen suddenly went black. I reset the PC using the reset button. The monitor worked at the BIOS post state of the boot process. Then the Windows sign showed briefly as it was beginning Windows, but then the monitor went black again. I went into the BIOS just to have a look around. It was still only detecting the one drive anywhere I looked. Remember, I never actually installed the new SATA drivers yet. I just downloaded them. I didn't get to click on it because my screen went black. To this day, I've got no idea why the screen went black at that moment. I exited without making any changes to the BIOS. I restarted, and this time at the beginning of the Windows load, it said, "Please wait." Then a blue screen showed. It said Windows did not shut down properly, and gave the option of a restart your PC or advanced options, and from there a reset. The reset gave the option to reinstall Windows, which I did not do. At this point, I must have turned the computer off somehow. I took out the M2 drive. I just wanted to take a step back. I put the SATA port of the boot drive back onto SATA 1. I put the SATA detect mode back to automatic. So now I've put the BIOS back to how it was in the beginning. I tried a new monitor. I took my oldest LCD monitor with a VGA cable. I think I was using an HDMI on the other one. It booted to, it looks like Windows did not shut down properly, blue screen again. I clicked restart my PC. The computer restarted, and this time it booted into Windows, and the monitor worked fine all the way into Windows. I re-downloaded the Asus SATA drivers and installed them. The installation went fine via the install folder. I think there's two folders, and you go into the install folder. I had to restart to complete the process, and that went fine. I then turned the computer off. I reinstalled the M2 drive physically. So now my original SSD was on its original SATA 1 port. None of the BIOS settings were changed. And so SATA detect was still on auto. I booted up, went into Windows. I didn't go into the BIOS at this point. The new M2 drive did not show in my PC. Now that's normal, by the way. However, it did show up under the disks in system information, showing the correct capacity and brand name. So this is the first time I've seen the computer recognize it in any way. After doing some research, I went into Disk Manager in Windows. You can find it by typing Disk Manager in the search bar. It's called Create and Format Hard Disk Partitions, but it's the same program. My old Windows boot drive showed us disk 0. The new drive showed and it was labeled as disk 1. I could see the new drive in the lower part of the disk management window. An initialized disk message appeared, or maybe I right-clicked and then initialized the new drive. I forget. The point is I initialized it somehow. And I initialized it as a GPT type partition. GPT is for larger than 2 terabyte normally, but I use it anyway as it's the more modern protocol. You should use MBR type if you want the drive to be readable by older versions of Windows. I was using Windows 10. Nothing really obvious happened after that, and I still could not see the drive in my PC. According to Windows, the latest driver updates were already installed. I think this is for the SSD itself, although it did give a 2006 driver date. I actually did not add any drivers specific to the new NVMe drive. So I restarted and went into the BIOS. I could now see the main M2 drive in the boot order options on the first page of the BIOS. This was the first time I'd ever seen it in the BIOS. So it was either the installation of the SATA drivers from Asus, or it was the initialize process in the disk management tool that allowed it to show in the BIOS. I think it was probably the drivers. It wasn't showing on the boot page though, under boot option 1 or boot option 2 on the initial menu, but it did show under hard drive BBS priorities, where it was listed as boot option 2. You could also see it listed in the boot override section. I didn't make any changes and exited the BIOS. I found it strange that SATA 1 still seemed to be working, because I had thought it was meant to be disabled once I had this new drive in. So I rebooted, went back into Windows, back into disk management. There's no option there to format the new drive, as various forum posts had claimed. The only option was to right-click the new drive and select New Simple Volume. As it turns out, this you have to do with any hard drive installation. So this isn't unusual. I just didn't know about it. So I selected New Simple Volume. I assigned the full 2 terabyte capacity. I selected drive letter. I chose K for Kingston because I was using a Kingston drive. You can also give it a label. I labeled it as Kingston 2 terabyte or 2 TB, all one word, just so I would always know in my computer what drive it was. So I went into my PC, or my computer as it used to be called, and the drive showed up. It was working. It was installed. I put a 50 gigabyte file on the new M2 drive, and I copied it to a new folder on the same drive. The speed was between 2.1 and 1.7 gigabytes per second, indicating speeds at least 3 times greater than SATA, which is 0.5 gigabytes per second. So the drive was working at NVMe speeds. It's not working at the theoretical PCIe 3.0 speed. I think the M3 socket's meant to have 4 lanes dedicated. However, my speeds might have been faster if I wasn't reading and writing to the same drive at the same time, but that's the only way I could really test it. And just to repeat, I wasn't running a video card during any of this. And yeah, since video cards are on PCI lanes, it may force you to use a different SATA boot drive port when you're booting Windows off a different drive. So that's the long version, guys. A lot of troubleshooting, but basically install your motherboard BIOS update first. Install your SATA drivers for the motherboard, put the drive in, go into disk management, initialize, do a New Simple Volume add, and Those are the main things. But it is a little hair raising. We had black screen of death, we had blue screen, we had a prompt to reinstall Windows, we shut down one of the SATA ports by accident at one point. So these things would all be very scary if you were dependent on that computer. So yeah, by all means, make sure you've got a spare computer, preferably one that's online so you can Google search and troubleshoot.